In this episode, Golden and I offer up a short, spoiler-free discussion of the new movie Ad Astra. Full speed ahead. Welcome to the Omega Beam number 50. I'm your host, Oren Merton, and this weekend we took a break from our usual superhero and action movie fare to see the science fiction art film Ad Astra, starring Brad Pitt. Don't know if this has been promoted heavily where you are, but we saw the previews before a bunch of movies. It looked kind of interesting, and we saw it, and we're glad we did. So we keep this discussion short and spoiler-free, so if you've seen it already or if you haven't, please go right ahead and enjoy. I am here with Golden to talk about the movie Ad Astra. What did you think?
Overall, I thought it was very good. It's an excellent movie.
It's not our usual fare of action-adventure, is it? It's much more of a cerebral type of sci-fi.
There's nothing wrong with that.
No, there is nothing wrong with that. I just think it's funny because I think a lot of people who went into this movie were expecting what Kevin Smith likes to call punchy. And this is not that kind of film. This is not an action movie. There are moments, there are sort of...
It definitely throws some punches in certain places.
Yeah, so it's not, just a movie of sitting around watching people think, but it is much more of a travel log than it is an adventure movie. And it's interesting. Two things I thought were interesting. One is that because I think some people, especially these days with big, huge action movies and Star Wars and everything, I think sometimes the fans expect that because the usual thing for Rotten Tomatoes is, well, let's take Godzilla King of the Monsters as an example. The critics were not crazy about it. It had like a 41% critical average, but the fans knew exactly what they were getting. You go to see kaiju monsters beating each other up, and you got it, and it looked great. And so 80% of the audience loved it. This movie seems to kind of be the opposite. Over 80% of the critics really love the movie, but only 60-some% of the audience has had that same reaction. And I think it's not because the movie's bad, and it's not because the movie's not enjoyable. I think it's because people walk in with expectations of maybe, you hear, $80 million movie and all these special effects. It looks gorgeous from the trailers, and Brad Pitt's a major star, and you expect maybe that kind of movie, but it's not. It's really more cerebral. I've seen online a lot of comparisons, and I get it, to the book Heart of Darkness, which for those of you who haven't read the Joseph Conrad book Heart of Darkness, think of the movie Apocalypse Now, where basically...
Well, Apocalypse Now is Heart of Darkness.
Right.
It is literally based on that.
It is his film, version of that, Coppola's film version of that, set in Vietnam. And this is set in space, but it's the same kind of thing. I mean, you can say that way off in the distance, sort of a commander has gone offline and they need to figure out what's going on. And so the Brad Pitt character goes on a journey. So it's a very similar...
He's brought in to try and make contact.
Yeah. It's a very similar sort of setup. And it's really kind of a rumination on loneliness, on what happens when you're out there by yourself, on different perceptions of the same thing. So I think it bites off a bunch of really interesting ideas. And it's for all that it is in space and there are some explosions and action scenes, but it's a very still movie.
I don't think that this movie, if they had rewritten it where it actually occurred on Earth,
mm-hmm.
I don't think it would have had the same impact.
Yeah.
And part of that is, and I've said this to you before, I said this to you right after the movie, the music,
mm-hmm.
whether it be who did the music or who mixed the sound and all of that, just timed it so well that you have instances where it's action and then there's this contrast of the fact that it's just completely quiet.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
if you're in space, you're not going to have the loud boomy that you have in other places.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it is. It's a combination of the sound mixer, who knew just when to mix the sound effects to the music to nothing.
If you're inside the spacesuit in the helmet, it's going to be different than if you are outside standing next to the person in the spacesuit with the helmet.
Exactly.
Part of this takes place on Earth. Part of this takes place on the moon.
Right.
Part of this takes place on Mars
Right.
or in a spaceship. I mean,
Right.
it's done so extremely well.
Right.
The sound and the way that the sound is presented in the movie is just incredible.
I agree completely. And I think this, in a way, goes back to our previous episode, which was a special edition with our friend David Rakelin about soundtracks, and how when we were talking about The Dark Knight and Hans Zimmer, he was talking about how it kind of blurs the lines when you get those really great textured electronic scores. It really blurs the line between sound design and composition. And I think this composer, Max Richter, who did a mostly electronic score, but it has some more organic sounds and everything. Like you were saying, it blends so well into the movie. And that's, he wrote a good score that can do that. And then the sound mixer used it sparingly and used it in just the right moments to evoke a mood and a texture in just the right way.
Not that any of the actors or actresses did a bad job. It's just, to me, that was the big takeaway for me from this film.
I would agree. And speaking of the acting, I think a lot of times the actors that get the most attention are the ones who do the really graphic, either visual transformations or have very histrionic parts and stuff. They're talking about, we haven't seen the movie yet, but there's been a lot of buzz about Joaquin Phoenix for the Joker. And you can see for the trailers that, boy, he's really become, something. It's very obvious that he's acting. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean that he is clearly putting his work right out there in front.
It looks like he's off his rocker.
Yeah. Whereas Brad Pitt is playing a very compartmentalized, almost emotionally stunted character. And he's acting as much. I mean, this is an acting role, and yet it's almost, you're almost, in his performance almost shows you what isn't happening rather than what is.
It's not that he hasn't ever played a role that is a little detached from his emotions.
Yeah.
Meet Joe Black was
sure.
And I mean, there's other roles. That's it. The role fit him very well because he's very good at doing that.
Right.
He's very good at playing that part.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. As far as the pacing goes, I tend to prefer movies that are really, really quick. This was not, but at the same time, since the events, I think, kept moving at a good pace, while the stillness really, gave everything time to breathe, it didn't feel like it was so slow. I was ready to do something else in the middle of the movie just to pass the time.
Well, it's a lot of, I mean, if it's going to take, I think it was 19 days for him to go from the moon to Mars.
Right.
You can't watch that entire time
right
in less than 2 hours and still have a movie. So I thought that they paced it really well. They had just enough that it wasn't going to be just, okay, well, we're going to get on the ship and then, okay, now we're there.
Right.
It's that things can happen from point A to point B.
And I know this is a movie, we've talked about this personally. I know this is a movie that you haven't seen, but I would compare the pacing of this movie to the movie Moon, which is also kind of a more cerebral think piece without it being a huge cast of thousands, big action set piece type of movie. Now, Moon is shorter, but it's got the same kind of pacing as Moon. And which is to say, if you liked Moon, I think you'd like this too. They're both, I think, sort of, they both take place in the near future, but they both are kind of what in literature is known as hard sci-fi, in the sense that they try and really ground it so that this looks like something that really could be happening in, the not distant future with the technology that we have today. It's not, and then they pulled out laser guns, or something that is obviously not going to happen. Then Tony Stark heals everyone with magic foam from his suit.
You can't expect it to go very quickly.
So I wanted to keep this spoiler free, and I think we kind of have hit on
in
most
terms
of
it looked realistic. It looked like this could be a possible future. It seemed very interesting and plausible, and they played enough with the characters, plot. So it was a good movie.
Yeah.
And I think that what comes to be from the very first 5 minutes of it really kind of comes back into play the last few minutes of it. And the character himself, you see him reach a point, and it's whether or not he goes past that point or falls.
Exactly. When we meet Roy McBride, the Brad Pitt character, he's in some ways the most put together character you've ever seen, because he's so, stable. He knows how to play the game, but he's also one of the most broken characters, I think.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see how his arc takes him.
I remember turning to you one point and saying, "This is the guy we want on our ship."
Yeah.
Because if he's a character that no matter what's going on, he has a clear head, he's able to think, and he's able to do what needs to be done.
Right. No, it's very true.
And that's kind of scary too, though.
Right.
Because sometimes what needs to be done is kind of scary.
So if you like cerebral sci-fi,
if you liked Moon, if you liked Arrival, just know that when you're going in to see this movie, that you're not going in to see a sci-fi Western.
This is Heart of Darkness, not Star Wars.
And I think one of your friends commented to someone else, probably not a movie that you want to go see when you're too tired.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it does have a slow and steady pace.
Yeah. It's the stillness, like I said.
And the music is both relaxing and on edge, and you're expecting something to happen, and is it going to really happen? And
yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, Golden.
You're welcome.
And that's it for this episode. You can find the show notes at theomegabeam.com/50. If you liked this episode, please leave a review in Apple Podcasts app or wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help people who could be interested in this kind of podcast find it, and we would appreciate it. If you have any comments or suggestions, just drop us a line at info@theomegabeam.com. Be good to yourselves and each other, and we'll catch you next time.